Often what happens is as time goes on, the way we show up every day, people sort of just default to their normal behavior patterns. And in culture, culture is really hard to build and really easy to lose, right? So if one person undermines something one day and it's not addressed, like that sets a new standard, a new norm for the rest of the team or for what this culture is. And so oftentimes you'll see as people move away from more frequent conversations about values and how we're showing up, that just normal behavior and basically what you tolerate will show up. And if what you're tolerating is toxicity, then you should expect more of that, because that's sort of like, we're all also a little bit selfish in our motivations, right? We're all also motivated to take care of ourselves, and we're motivated by status and power and hierarchy and all those things that play out in a workplace or in a sports team or any other social sphere, really. And so people are going to default to behavior that moves them in the direction that they want to go in, with less regard than is probably warranted for the people around them.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jay Scherr, host of Business Minds Coffee Chat, where you get a captivating look inside the minds of game changers, risk takers, and visionaries who turn ideas into breakthroughs that shake up the world. Our mission is to give you fresh ways to think that spark growth in your business and life so you can make a mark that lasts. I thought a good starting point just to kick the conversation off would be for you to share maybe one or two traits about yourself that are your absolute favorites.
Oh, what an interesting way to start this conversation. I don't often think of myself in that way. So just like the rest of us who are figuring out how to optimize our mindset, I'm constantly working on that too. But the
Good.
things I like most about myself, I think I have a tendency towards high levels of joy pretty often. So I'm a pretty happy guy, and I tend to find the good in most of life. Some people will give me a hard time and tell me I'm too optimistic, but I think it's mostly worked quite well for me. So I like that about myself. And I do have a real deep drive for excellence. And I think that pushes me forward in the work I do, but also, of course, with my family and my kids in particular. And I think that has also served me quite well. And I like those two things about me. I wouldn't change them.
Good. Well, I love those too. And those are very similar to two traits that I would point out about myself. And I want to start with the first one. So that high level of joy. So is that something that you find that you need to work on a regular basis, or is it really just part of your DNA and how you show up?
It's kind of a both and. I think I do have, I had a therapist at one point who described my baseline as a step above cheerful. And I think that's probably pretty true. But I do work pretty actively to keep myself in a joyous headspace. So, I'm not a big journaling person, but I do take moments to reflect and practice gratitude. I do actively work to find the good in whatever situation I'm in. I try to learn and extract things from any situation I'm in, whether it's a hardship or a success. I think there's a lot to be learned from either side. And I think those sort of basic practices sustain a lot of that. And I do think if you find yourself looking, you can find a lot in the world that's actually quite good. There's even been some books written about, how much the world has improved, even in my lifetime, that we just don't talk about, or you don't hear so much about in the news or in, Facebook or wherever else you're getting your information from. But if you look around, there's tons of great stuff happening. And so I try really hard to kind of soak that up and keep it simple. And I do find that helps me sustain that baseline level of cheeriness.
I love that so much. Okay, so with that said, do you also limit the types of information that you allow into your consciousness? So whether it's news, social media, are you hyper aware of what you're paying attention to?
It's a really great question. Actually, I ran a little experiment on myself that sort of pushed me in the right direction with this. So, I'm sure you've seen what gets posted of mine on social media, but I actually lock myself out of social media all day. Basically, I brought one of those brick devices and I just put my social media apps on there, and my brick device is actually at another location. So like I have to drive out of the way to unlock my phone. And so I keep myself out of social media. Obviously, I schedule all those posts well in advance. And, sometimes people say like, oh, I thought that thing thing you wrote about today was interesting. And I'm like, what did I write about today? I didn't look. Like I scheduled that and I sort of put it away. And I did find that after, I was spending a lot of time interacting on social media and engaging with people who are interested in my work. And that's rewarding in its own right. But of course, all the information you take in also can be a bit much. And so I found that my mood did improve quite considerably, just not being on social media at all. No Instagram, no LinkedIn, no Facebook. I'll go in and repost stuff periodically, but then I brick myself back out of there, and I try to stay pretty consistent with that. And so I found that to be quite useful. And I did that for about a month over this past summer, and was like, whoa, this is wild how much my attention is better, my mood seems better, just little things that I noticed that were pretty impactful. And so I've stuck with that. And then I am a big on limiting the amount of other news or things I take in. My parents will, of course, criticize me for my inability to know all that's happening in the world right now. But I find, as I'm sure anyone who watches the news can attest, that regardless of where you fall in the spectrum, like it's pretty repetitive, and everything is sort of the same thing day after day. And I just don't find that negative messaging about either party to be all that moving or rewarding to be engaged with. And so no news for me, no news reading. If something's like really important, the really important people in my life will let me know.
That's funny. That's exactly how I feel about at least the news. If there is something important that I have to know about, I'm going to find out one way or the other, right? Whether it's passing a monitor at an airport, a headline in the news, or a family member calling or a friend calling. So like you, I really work very hard to filter the type of information that I'm receiving. Same thing with the type of books that I read, the types of books I listen to, podcasts, etc. I have found, and this is just purely through my own personal experience and then also coaching others, that information that we consume has such an incredible impact on not only our worldview, but how we show up, our level of joy, our level of sadness, right? All of those variables play such a role, which obviously impacts performance and how we show up in our business and in our personal lives as well. So thank you for sharing that. Now, you did mention something as you were sharing part of what we were just discussing, and that was around hardship and success. So what I'd love to hear from you is, could you give us an example through your own personal experience of one of the more challenging hardships that you have experienced? And when you're doing that, I would love it if you would share a lesson that you learned through that experience. And then we're going to do the same thing with one of the greatest levels of success that you have personally experienced, and also what you learned from that. So let's start with the hardship. And it could be at any period of life. It could be personally or professionally.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'm going through one of those right now. So, Kirsty and I have separated and are navigating our life with two young kids. And obviously that's been extremely challenging and very emotional to sort of figure out what's the right decision for us and for our kids, and how do we manage those things quite well. And I think for me, there was a lot that went into, what that meant. So I've, of course, done a lot of reflecting on myself and how I show up in relationships, and what parts of myself did I maybe let go of that I actually really would have preferred to keep, and what parts of me could have been improved, or what could I have done better that would have made the relationship more successful. And I think, gravitating towards things like speaking up more. I sort of lost my voice a little bit, and did the happy wife, happy life thing, which I'm not sure is always great advice. And so I learned a little bit about myself through that process, and obviously I've, gotten support with that, and thought about ways that I might show up differently in other relationships in the future, being a bit more open or more vulnerable, being more comfortable sharing what I actually think, and not being afraid to, hurt someone's feelings. Even if you do, you can kind of repair that and move forward. So I think that's been quite useful. But it's also just been really interesting to sort of see how my experience of the world changes as a function of the relationships I have. I think so much of what it means to be a man growing up in America is to think of yourself as like a rugged individual, right? It's like you're a lone wolf. You go out there and you do it on your own and you figure it out. And, the people around you are sort of there, but they don't really matter so much because you've got to figure it out on your own. And I've been just extremely fortunate to have an incredibly supportive group of people around me that I really haven't had to rely on in this way. And so to have that insight that like there are a lot of people who will really show up for me and care for me when I need it, and that it's okay to ask for that, I think has been quite profound. And has changed the way that I think about the way I show up and support other people, has changed the way I think about what it means to ask for help. And of course, this entire experience has given me a tremendous amount of empathy for anyone going through some, pretty intensive relational difficulty. And of course, it takes two to tango, right? Like I'm part of the problem as well. And so having to reflect on that and identify what parts of me weren't the best that I could be in that relationship, I think has been good insight too.
So before we go to the success piece, I just want to add to what you just shared, and I feel for you, and I know that that's a challenging experience to go through, and it speaks also to something that you had said earlier about the power of therapy, right? I also am a strong advocate for therapy, and one of the things that I learned through therapy is that I have had a very challenging time expressing my own feelings and sharing things that would be very vulnerable. And as a result, it hurt my own relationship with my wife. And, I'm working through that, right? Learning how to be more expressive. And a lot of that, Alex, certainly came from the way that I was raised, not to point fingers in any one direction, but I was brought up with, with that common phrase that, men don't show their feelings, right? They don't show their emotions, right? They're the tough person, right? And I remember many, many years ago, the individual who officiated our wedding had said to my wife before we were married, that people called your soon-to-be husband Stonewall because he just maintained such a stoic look about him. He just didn't share anything. And so we all learn, we all grow as we go along. But I think to something that you said, asking for help, surrounding yourself with others who can not only hold up a mirror, but who can provide good guidance and counsel, who've been there before and who are qualified to be able to provide the kind of help that we need. I think that's really important.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's been probably the most important thing I've done in this process. So would of course advocate for, I'm biased as a psychologist, but would advocate for everyone going and getting that level of support.
Absolutely. Okay. So let's talk about the other side of that coin. So let's talk about success. So give us an example of, either personally or professionally, where you've experienced the greatest level of success, and let's just say joy, right? Fulfillment and joy from something that you did or have done. And what did you learn from that experience?
Can I give you two? Because they're kind of like on different ends of the spectrum, but it'll be interesting to compare and contrast. And I'm going to use this forum to unpack some of that, Jay, if that's okay, because I haven't had this opportunity. So the first one would be like in a professional sphere. I coached college football for a bit of time, and it's very hard to explain what it feels like to win a game to people who have never been in that position. Because the amount of work and preparation that goes into it, the amount of coordination and care between teammates and staff members that goes into it, it's like a pretty special experience to see it all culminate on one day and the outcome sort of is what you've worked so hard for. And so I think, obviously have won several games, but it's still like a pretty interesting experience to try to capture. I still can't really put words to what it feels like to be on the team in that way, working on it. And even as a sports psychologist, I don't have quite that same experience because I'm not removed, but it's a different role. And I play a different role now than I did as a coach. And so I think what I've learned from that is one, that not all good things need to be explained, that it's okay to just sort of like sit with the experience and you don't have to call it anything. You can just sort of like appreciate what that was and sort of sink back into the feeling without having to call it anything. I think second is, for me, was a really important lesson about how working really hard with the outcome that you want can be quite meaningful. And I think oftentimes, hard work can get a bad rap if you work more than 40 hours, right? Or people like tell you that the the grind mentality is bad. And I certainly don't subscribe to the grind set, if you will. But I do think there's a time and place for some really hard work, especially if it is pushing you towards something meaningful. And if you're able to sort of like see the fruits of your labor at some point, I think that could be really rewarding. And then third is I think there's no better experience than doing something fun and competitive and meaningful with other people that you care about. And the more that you can kind of recreate that experience in your life, whether that's with your partner or your family or a sports team as an adult or, at work, whatever it is, like, I think the more meaningful your life will be. And so that's a big part of why I stay in sports, because I do get to have a lot of those experiences, and it is really meaningful for me. The second kind of joyous experience, and then I'll let you tell us like which one you want to go for if there's more to share. But it's interesting to think of this as like a big success. But my oldest daughter is 3, and she's potty training, and we had our first emergency, a couple of weeks ago. And for the parents listening, or Jay, I don't know if you have kids, like, it's an interesting experience to go through, right? You're like driving in the car, and all of a sudden it's like we're about to be in full down meltdown mode. And my daughter is very smart. And so we pull over and we go into the grocery store, and she's like ready to go. And the grocery store is locked, and she's kind of panicking. And I'm like, it's okay, we're going to figure it out. I pick her up. I'm carrying my other, baby at this point. And my kids are 3 and 1. We're both kind of walking around trying to figure it out. And we finally get my daughter to this restaurant. We get her in, and she manages to successfully go potty. And she's just so happy with herself that she managed to sort of get there, that she managed to like give voice to the fact that she was having an emergency and she was uncomfortable and she needed something. And then I felt so much pride in her for being able to do that. And it was one of the first moments I've had as a dad where I'm like, oh, I think I can actually do this dad thing. Like, there's still a lot to learn, but I think there's more here for me. Like, I might be okay at this if I can figure it out. And so it was just a really cool moment to sort of have with her, where she was so proud of herself and so happy for how she managed. And as a result, I was like, okay, the two of us can do this thing together. We're going to be all right. And so it was a very silly but fun and joyous experience too.
Those are 2 great examples. And I love the second one. At least for me, it's very relatable. And I'm sure that many who are watching and listening right now can certainly relate to that. And the thing that, one of the things that I heard through that story with your daughter is that you were providing a level of reassurance that you two were going to figure this out. So even though the store was locked, was closed, immediately, instead of, she's in panic mode, which meant that you could have also gone into panic mode, like, uh-oh, now what are we going to do, right? But you immediately shifted to, we can figure out a solution. Everything is figure outable. We just need to find it. And I think that teaches a very valuable lesson to young people of all ages, that when we're confronted with those emergency situations, whether it's going to the potty or we lose something that is very valuable or we miss a flight, whatever it is, if you take just a moment to pause, to think, and instead of going into, freeze or fight or flight mode, we think about the solution, because when we can do that, we have a better chance of finding it. Thoughts on that?
100%. Well, my first thought as I'm listening to you is this is where all the mindset skills come in, right? I mean, a big part of why I'm having that reaction is like, okay, like I know how to manage this, right? I know how to manage my physiology. I know how to manage my attention. I know how to manage my self-talk. And to a degree that allows me to help manage hers, right? I mean, a lot of the self-talk our kids verbalize, or the things they say out loud, or the things that we've said to them in some way, shape, or form, right? And so what's happening in their head is a bit of a reflection of us. And so the more that you can, let them know, right? Hey, we're going to be okay. We've got this. We'll figure it out. Like, we're just going to go to the next place, and it's not a big deal. For them, that's teaching them and wiring their nervous system into this place where they can be a bit more grounded and calm. And so much of each of those experiences really are about basic mindset skills, right? Like being present, being willing to sort of search for solutions, managing your own heart rate and your sweaty palms and your sweaty brow and all those things that come with anxiety, so that you can figure out the right decision, and being able to sort of systematically evaluate what's the right thing to do, all comes as a function of ultimately like really good self-regulation skill.
Absolutely. Now, that doesn't mean, for everyone that's watching and listening right now, that doesn't mean that it's easy, and that if this isn't something that you've practiced before, that it just happens automatically. Like most things that are important, it takes work. Takes time, takes repetition, takes working with somebody who can really provide you the right types of tools and strategies to use in situations like that. But again, I just want to highlight what an incredibly valuable lesson to instill in a young person. Now, I know that your daughter's 3 years old, but those types of learning opportunities are going to continue to come, right? That won't be the last one. There'll be more of them. But think about how you set someone else up for success when you provide those types of tools in their toolbox. And I quite honestly, I think that's really phenomenal, whether it's a personal situation, business situation, sports, no matter what it is. When we know how to self-regulate, when we know how to be able to use some of those tools to be able to come up with the solutions we need to move forward, that's a game changer.
That's exactly
a game
right.
changer.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. So you had talked about team and the that feeling of working with a team. Can you share with us why working with a team can take us further than just individually? So let's talk about whether it's, performance coaching for an individual versus performance coaching for team. Can you maybe compare and contrast a little bit? Are both important? Is one better than the other? Where can we learn to become our best?
Both are important, but they're sort of like, the way I would think about it is you're maybe pulling different levers in those different situations, right? So broad strokes, people really want to feel part of something bigger than themselves. It's extremely motivating for us to feel a sense of belonging or community. And, for those of you familiar with self-determination theory, which has been written about, in several popular books, right? Like the third component of that is all about relationships and connectedness with other people. And other people really do push us to become more than we think that we can be. And a team is just a great forum for, having someone to hold you accountable to that, and feeling connected enough to other people that you want to push yourself to reach that level. And so relationships are a huge source of motivation, but also resilience, feedback, information that allows us to maybe extract something out of ourselves that we wouldn't really be able to get on our own. But then if you look at it sort of like performance coaching from an individual or team level, at the team level, what you're really trying to do is shape the culture or the environment and the interactions between the people in the organization to bring out the best in people, right? And so, there's some data came out of the English Institute of Sport, a while ago that shows that about 70% of our behavior is impacted by what's going on in the environment around us. And so if the environment that you walk into, if the team that you walk into is toxic, let's say, right? Bad relationships, people talking behind each other's back, stabbing each other in the back, not supporting each other. Like, I don't know anyone that wants to show up to that work environment and feels like they're going to do good work there. And honestly, there isn't anybody that could do that, no matter how sort of ruggedly individual and powerful you think you are. The neurochemistry, the shaping of your behavior, all those things are changing as a function of you entering that environment. And so as a performance coach, if I can get that stuff flowing in the right direction, pointed in the right direction, you could have a really big impact on the individual behavior. And there's all sorts of things that play into that, right? Whether it's social norms, like people don't really want to deviate much from a group, or setting really high standards that now people feel beholden to, like all those things can shape behavior in a really meaningful way. Not to mention the fact that these people can just be good sources of information, resilience, social support, all these other things that help us all perform better. On the individual side, you're thinking about, how do I shape my interactions with that team, or how do I show up and be the best I can be to this team to contribute? But you're also thinking about, how do you maybe manage some of the parts of the team that are hard so that it doesn't totally disrupt your performance? And then of course you're thinking about individual performance attributes or skills, right? So every individual performer, say on a basketball team, is going to have different things that they're thinking about, worried about, want to work on. But if you can work on all of them individually and they all show up as their best to the team, you're going to get sort of a virtuous cycle, right? Where everything's pointed in the right direction and both team and individual can perform better.
Okay, so let me ask you then, can we stay on culture for a moment?
Sure.
Because I see that this is something that certainly crosses over for all of us, whether it's business related, sports, etc. So, if you were to walk into a client's business or sports team and you noticed that they did have a toxic culture and it was obviously affecting performance, it was affecting both team as well as individual performance, and people were probably leaving as a result, what would be in your experience, what would be a good starting point for looking to change culture in those cases where there is toxicity there?
I've never been exposed to it. Doesn't mean it couldn't exist, but it'd probably be pretty hard to find. I've never been exposed to an organization, sports or business, where the values of the organization are something bad or toxic, right? No one builds a company and says, like, I'm here to hurt people, right? It's all about excellence or, fun or working hard and getting your stuff done or whatever it is, right? So I think one starting point is returning back to, like, what is it that we're actually trying to create here? What's the experience we're trying to create, and where have we gone off the rails? And so oftentimes, people will say that they have a set of values, but they're not holding people to a standard that reflects those values, right? So, as a really simple example, we say that we work hard, but we don't hold people to working more than, an hour a day, right? Like, at some point that your culture is not reflecting what you say that you care about. And then obviously you could think about other ways that that shows up, right? So teams will say they value respect, but we allow people to talk over each other or be rude to each other or whatever it might be. And so I'd start by looking at the values and understanding, like, what is it that we say that we care about, and how is that care showing up, or is it showing up at all? The second element I would look at is, what are the standards that we have around those values? So, if it's respect, let's say, like, that might be around the way that we communicate, how responsive we are to each other, the way we support each other at work. And there's lots of different ways you could think about bringing respect to life. And that's really what the standard is for, right? Is to tell us all, how do we do respect here? And if we don't have clarity on how we do respect here, then people won't really know how to behave. And so people will have their individual variations of what it means to do respect. And for some people, that might be okay. And for other people, it may not be okay. And so you want to figure out, like, okay, how do we bridge that gap? It doesn't mean that one person's version is better or worse, but we do have to have a shared mental model, a shared understanding of how we all do respect here, so that people can understand what will or won't work and what it means when someone does a specific behavior that maybe we don't understand so much. And if you think about, say, again, a basketball team, like when I was with the Raptors, one of the things we did was we hung, the flag of each player, their home nation flag, up in the practice facility. And at one point we had like 14 or 15 flags up there. Well, how Americans do freedom is very different from how Canadians do freedom, but both value freedom. So let's talk about what it means for an American who values freedom and what it means for a Canadian who values freedom, and how do those things show up and how do we work with that together? It doesn't mean one's better or worse, but we do have to build some level of understanding of what that means so that we can work well together as a team. And then the third thing I'd look at is norms, right? Often what happens is, as time goes on, the way we show up every day, people sort of just default to their normal behavior patterns. And in culture, culture is really hard to build and really easy to lose, right? So if one person undermines something one day and it's not addressed, like, that sets a new standard, a new norm for the rest of the team, or for what this culture is. And so oftentimes you'll see, as people move away from more frequent conversations about values and how we're showing up, that just normal behavior and basically what you tolerate will show up. And if what you're tolerating is toxicity, then you should expect more of that, because that's sort of like, we're all also a little bit selfish in our motivations, right? We're all also motivated to take care of ourselves, and we're motivated by status and power and hierarchy and all those things that play out in a workplace or in a sports team or any other social sphere, really. And so people are going to default to behavior that moves them in the direction that they want to go in, with less regard than is probably warranted for the people around them. And so if you're not examining the norms and figuring out how do we push that behavior back in the right direction toward the standards that we want to uphold, and you're not intervening when someone is undermining that, you're going to have that pretty problematic culture. So those would be sort of the three levels I'd look at right away. And then, the easiest one is probably to start with clarifying the values and sort of reverse engineer back down. It can be really hard to hold people accountable, especially when you haven't been for a while. And so sometimes a hard reset's a good way to do it, but you can also work bottom up.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm also, as you're sharing all of this, of course, I'm thinking about leadership skills, leadership training as well, because to your point, you can have strong values, you can have standards, you can have norms, let's say defined, written out. But if you're not holding, to me, leadership begins within, right? If we're not holding ourselves accountable as a leader, then we can't expect to be able to hold others accountable or for others to hold themselves accountable, right? Because oftentimes we learn by what we see are by example of the leaders that are around us. So it really does have to start from within, starting with you as the leader. But that's fascinating, though. I appreciate you sharing that. So I wanted to ask you, as I was thinking about our conversation today, and I think about high performance and high performing teams and those that are at the top of their game, is in your experience, is high performance or high performing available to everyone? And if it is, what would you say are some of the core drivers that we can all learn or begin to learn that can help us become the best that we can be?
I love this question, Jay. Thank you for asking this because I think it's like one of the most important things we could talk about. Yes, so I think that everyone has within them the capacity to be a high performer. To me, that's really about reaching your full potential. And I think what's awesome about that is like it really doesn't matter what domain you're doing it in. It just matters that you care about it, right? So if you're a parent, like it's a stay-at-home mom, let's say, or a stay-at-home dad, like your high performance can be raising your kids and parenting your kids, and that's great. Like that's awesome. It's about how you show up and do it, and I'll give you some of the frameworks I might think about for that here in a second. But that same principle applies to whether it's work or friendships, if that's really important to you. Like we all can be that high performing person. Sports is a cool example because we get to see it all on TV, but ultimately like everyone has it within them to sort of unlock their full potential. But a big part of it is figuring out, some of the different steps that go into doing that consistently. So the first thing I would think about for anyone who's interested in reaching their full potential is sort of making sure you got your baseline taken care of. That's basic things, sleep, movement, nutrition, hydration, social circle, right? Things that are just important for us to even have an opportunity to perform well. So if you take an athlete, for example, right? Like you're not going to be a high performing athlete or your highest performing self if you're not sleeping and you're not eating well. It's just kind of like it's just a prerequisite to getting to the point where we can even talk about you having a consistently excellent performance. And there's tons of data to back this up, but you also see it at the highest levels of sport, right? Like Tom Brady, for example, was big on his own diet and his own exercise routine. If anyone's watched Quarterback on Netflix, you see Patrick Mahomes does his own thing. And it's not that they don't value the team resources, it's that to reach that level of excellence, you kind of have to have your own framework, your own way of doing things that make sure you check all these boxes off and that you're doing it in a way that's meaningful for you. But if you don't have that foundation, you can't do it, right? So, if you're going to crush Chick-fil-A 6 times a week, like, if you're young, you'll probably be okay, but you won't be at the full potential that you have, right? If you're a founder and you're not watching what you're eating and you're not sleeping well and you're not exercising, like these are all things that contribute to kind of the core currency or core competency of what it means to be a founder, which is making decisions, right? We know that what you eat affects your cognition. We know that how little you exercise affects your cognition. We know that if you sleep less than 6 hours for more than 2 nights in a row, your cognitive performance drops to the level of a 5th grader. Like we have data to back that up. And so you've got to start with that kind of foundational level of I'm getting the basics done right and I'm doing them consistently enough. It's not about being perfect. It's about being consistent. And if you can do it consistently, you'll have room for, the periodic, whatever it is that your vice is, that's okay. Like it's not about doing it 100% of the time. It's about doing it enough that you can kind of consistently push into the next phase of what it means to be excellent. The second thing I would encourage people to think about is regulating their nervous system. And we've talked a little bit about this so far, but really it's hard to reach a peak performance if you can't have some level basically like self-control and the ability to direct, control, modulate your thinking, feeling, physiology, and behavior, right? If you're really impulsive, if you're driven by your emotion, if you're unclear about what you think or what you value, of course, it's going to be hard to reach your full potential because you're going to be constantly pulled in all these different directions, right? And honestly, ultimately, it'll probably go back to that first level, right? If you're impulsive, let's say, right, you might skip a meal, or you might, not care about what you're doing with your sleep, or you might, do whatever. And like, it's very, very hard to be great at what you want to be great at if you're not being consistent in those two things. But, a big part of that is having good sense of how I stay composed, basically, and how I move consistently toward what it is I care about and my values. The third thing I'd encourage people to tap into would be their attention. And the basic skill here would be mindfulness. And, mindfulness has been written about, talked about a lot. Sometimes it gets like this kind of airy fairy or religious connotation, but ultimately mindfulness is just attention training. It's just training our brain to be in the here and now, to deal with distraction effectively, and to learn to let go of things that pass by our head and to come back to whatever it is that we're doing. We think somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 thoughts a day. So if you're spending all your time paying attention to that, you're missing a ton of the world going on around you. Some data shows that we spend over 50% of our sort of cognitive awake time, if you will, in the future or the past, right? It's a lot of time to not be present. And so if you can get even 5% better or 10% better at being present, you make a huge, huge difference in your performance. And that's something we often start with when we're working with pro athletes, as maybe the first skill that we teach. In fact, my business partner and I, when we went to do our first presentation to the Jaguars, the only skill we taught to the Jaguars was mindfulness meditation as a starting point. Now, of course, We're talking about these other things, but it's such a foundational skill. I think of it as sort of like the center of a pivot point, right? Where you can take it anywhere, but if you do it well, it contributes to sleep, it contributes to impulse control, it contributes to self-regulation, it contributes to decision making, and it contributes to the final level that I'd talk about here for high performance, which is sort of what we might call cognitive strategies, right? It's the things you're used to. It's self-talk, it's visualization, it's figuring out like how to manage your energy using your internal narrative, and those things are all also quite useful. And then all this is sort of wrapped up in the service or direction of what you care about, right? So ultimately your values and goals are what really drives your ability to be high performing. If you don't have clarity on who it is you want to become, what it is that you're working toward, it's hard to put all these things together and do it in a way that's going to sustain motivation over time. But if you've got clarity on what you're working toward and who you want to be, and then you can get these kind of 4 levels put together in a way that works for you, again, anyone has the opportunity to unlock their full potential.
Okay, a lot there, which is amazing. I'd love to go a little deeper on just a couple of those areas. Obviously, we can't spend a lot of time on each of them, but there's a couple that I'd love to get some additional insight from you. Are you good with that?
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's start. So let's go from the assumption for a moment that someone already understands their values and their goals, right? What's important to them. Okay, so we've got that piece established. Now, let's talk about regulating our nervous system. This is one that I see. It's such a huge factor, and it just seems like I'm probably looking through a warped lens, but it just seems like today, especially, we have a tendency to see more things that come up that either trigger us or that can create, where they can flood our system. And so many of us just don't know how to regulate our nervous system. So let's start with that for a moment, if we can go a little deeper there and talk about some very specific strategies that we can use to regulate our nervous system. And I'll share one that I use, and then I'd love for you to either poke holes in that or expand on that a bit further and maybe talk about the science behind it. So whenever I feel that I'm being triggered or that I'm flooded for whatever reason, or I can feel that happening, The first thing is I have the self-awareness to be able to notice when that's happening. And I've done that through training and just years of working on that. But when it begins to happen, I just pause. I stop what I'm doing. I usually shut my eyes and I start to breathe with intention. Deep breaths in through my nose. I hold it for a few seconds and then I let the air out, typically somewhat forcefully, not to the point where I'm feeling dizzy, but I'll do that a number of times. And meanwhile, remember that I'm pausing here, right? So I'm not reacting to something. I'm giving myself time to calm down, to breathe, and to think. Because what I'm trying to do is really activate the prefrontal cortex so I can think more logically and not get pulled into something that I'll either regret or saying something that I could potentially regret. And so that's really my initial process that I go through. And it doesn't take very long, but it gives me just enough time to regulate. So let me turn it over to you. Poke holes in that. Yes, no, the science behind it. What can I add to that? And what else can we share with our audience?
Yeah, no hole poking from me on this one, because breath work is one of the first things I would suggest for people who are working on this for a couple of reasons,
Okay.
right? So first is there's obviously a very intimate and intricate link between our breathing and our overall nervous system function, right? So super basic premise, but longer exhale than inhale is going to slow your heart rate down, drive that sort of like activated physiology back to a more manageable place. And if you practice that, you can access that pretty easily. And it sounds like, Jay, you've practiced this skill a lot. And so when you get activated, you're aware, and then you're able to use the skill to get yourself back to a good place. And so breath work is a great way to just bring that sort of, I think of it as like a pot of boiling water, right? Bring that simmer back down to somewhere level where you can make a better decision and you can be a little bit more grounded. You can pause and get yourself some clarity and sort of tap back into your values or what you're really trying to accomplish here without being driven by your initial impulses. And that can be quite powerful. The second thing you're doing, which I don't know if you're doing it consciously or not, but it's really interesting, is the experience of emotion lasts around 90 seconds. It can last sometimes up to 30 minutes. So it depends kind of on what you're feeling and what the experience is. But that initial activated physiology we get when someone says something, we're like, oof, that sucked, or man, that really hurt, or oh, you pissed me off, right? Like that initial physiological response doesn't really last that long. But what happens is we kind of maintain that arousal because we're thinking about what's just happened over and over and over again. And so what you've done is you sort of stepped out of that, overwhelming physiological experience. You've brought the physiology back down. You've given yourself, it sounds like, 30 to 90 seconds to sort of let this stuff pass. And then you're not replaying it in your head over and over and over again, maintaining that activation. You're bringing yourself back down and you're letting the emotion pass. And now you can do whatever you want to do from a place of being really centered. It's a myth that we can make decisions only based on our thinking. Like we're always feeling something. We always have some baseline mood, some kind of affective process going on because the brain is super connected, right? So you don't get to shut off your feelings. But what you do get to do is not be totally driven by really the agitation we feel when we get really activated like that. And ultimately, that's what leads to saying things that we regret, right? It's not about emotion versus cognition. It's about dealing with this sort of third variable of feeling so agitated, like we just want to strike back, that right. leads to us, lashing out and hurting. So I think the strategy you've given is great. And a couple others I might give people that are sort of similar in the same school, if you will. One would be called progressive muscle relaxation. It's just this process where you kind of tense your muscles and then you let them relax, and you tense and you let them relax, and you work from your head down to your toes. There's a bunch of free guided ones on YouTube that you can find. And all it is really, again, learning to consciously let go of tension is really kind of the core of what this process is. And then the third thing is, it's related to that sort of foundational level I gave you, but like ultimately so many of these skills are facilitated by sleeping well. So that's the third skill I'd give you, right? Is get a good night's sleep. I mean, again, emotion regulation, decision making, even social relationships are all facilitated by having healthy night's sleep. And there's lots of information out there on good sleep, but the basics are like 7 to 8 hours. Try to wake up at the same time consistently every morning, and just prioritizing. Leave yourself enough time to get a good night's sleep. It's going to make everything else that you do much easier.
Absolutely. So we've had various sleep experts on the podcast before, and I really appreciate the strategies that we learn on how to enhance the quality of our sleep, because, it's not just the hours that you think you're getting, it's actually the quality of the sleep itself that makes the biggest difference. And there are things that we probably all do, if we don't know any better, that truly are affecting our sleep, whether it's, consuming alcohol, whether it is watching TV or being on our computer right before we decide to shut down for the night, or, just having too many lights, right? Not being in the right type of environment that's conducive for sleeping. The quality of our bed, our pillow, right? All those things have an impact. So it's really interesting when you dig more deeply into that science. But I appreciate you bringing that up. So another one that I would love for us. Oh, and I do want to just share with everyone that although I have a lot of practice with this, and I do have that self-awareness, that doesn't mean I get it right every time. I certainly don't. There's plenty of times where either I just get pulled into something, and then, it's then that I start to beat myself up, right, with self-talk, negative self-talk. So I don't want anybody to think that I am by any means an expert at it. I do really work hard to make sure that I do maintain as much self-control as I possibly can, and learning from you, Alex, as an example is incredibly beneficial to me, and I know it's going to be for all of you that are watching and listening as well. So another one that you mentioned, and I just brought up just now, self-talk. So the cognitive strategy. So let's talk about self-talk for a moment, and maybe you could provide for us some strategies that we can use when we have that negative self-talk, or we're beating ourselves up. How do we work around that, or how do we work through it?
Well, Jay, I'll also say I don't always get it right, and self-talk it's a good area for you to bring up, because it's what I can kind of consistently improve in.
Okay.
But I think there's a few thoughts here. The first is that we're all kind of, in our culture, especially in Western culture, sort of socialized into looking for problems more than positives. If you think about even back to like grade school, right? When you wrote a good sentence in third grade, it was very rare that your teacher would point out great sentence. What was much more likely is, you had a grade circled in red pen at the top and a bunch of stuff crossed out underneath that you could have done better. So from a pretty young age, we're sort of wired to look for problems or look for the negative. And there's some evolutionary science behind this, right? Like there's this idea that if we, scan for threats more effectively, we might be more likely to detect that, tiger in the bushes that might jump out and get us. But in today's world, that's not really that necessary. Like it's pretty unlikely a tiger's going to come get me. But that same sort of like circuitry and evolutionary bias does dominate the way that we interact all in today's world. And so I think first is just being aware of that, right? That like we all have a little bit more of a natural tendency toward pessimism or negativity in our internal dialogue, usually as a function of trying to protect ourselves. So recognizing that this negative self-talk, it's trying to help you. It just may not be the most effective way to do it. Though there are some people that actually do quite well with negative self-talk. So really the way I think about it is this helping you or hurting you? It's not about is the content or valence positive or negative as much as is this useful or not? If it's not useful, even if it's super positive, it may not be useful, right? Like writing affirmations in lipstick on your mirror is not going to build your confidence, right? But it may feel good. It's just not useful for actually doing what you're trying to do. And so you've got to sort of tease into like, does this work or not? So that would be one place I'd point people to start, is less about like, did I just say something negative, or did I just say something hurtful, or did I say something helpful? Those things might help you. The second thing would be to look for places where you use extreme language in the way that you talk to yourself. So these would be things like always, never, must, should, can't, won't, language that tends to signify what we would call black and white thinking. And when our self-talk is really black and white, it does feel negative, but the world is all sorts of shades of gray, of course. And so I've never met anyone who is always something or never something. It's always a bit of both. And so recognizing that we do have a tendency to, like for myself, for example, when I make a mistake, I might say, "Oh, I always get that wrong." It's like, well, is that really true, or is this just my sort of default way of responding? And so the third thing I would say is to examine the evidence, right? To look at the data and see, like, well, is it really true that you always get this wrong, or that you never do that, or is it true that you must do it this way? And chances are the answer is no, right? And so then it would be taking that same statement and putting it into something that's much more practical and accurate, right? So instead of, I always get that wrong, it's, hey, when I'm feeling rushed and feeling a bit strained, when I am, like this morning, I forgot something for my daughter. Like, oh, I always forget things for my daughter. It's like, okay, well, is that true or not? Well, no, it's not true. Okay, what would be more accurate? When I'm feeling rushed and I want to get somewhere on time, I tend to move too quickly. And when I move too quickly, I might forget something. Well, that's a very different way of talking to myself than, you're such an idiot. I can't believe you forgot that thing again. You're never going to get this right. What a problematic dad you are. Must be like, no one should leave you with this kid alone. Like that's the rabbit hole we all go down. And so I think if you can get to that more balanced and ultimately accurate place, I think it's better. And the core of kind of good self-talk ultimately is self-honesty, right? If you can be real with yourself about what is actually happening, you're going to find that some things that you think you're great at, you might be a little worse at, or might not be so strong. But a lot of things that you feel really crappy about are probably going to be much better. And if you can get to that point of honest self-reflection, you can do a lot of real good from that place.
That is so good. And I love the fact that you're actually, so when you have that negative self-talk, that you're actually questioning it. And I think that's so important. I try to do the same thing as well. The interesting thing that I found, and I'd love to hear your thought on this, is I feel that we will go to the ends of the earth to find evidence to support the thing that we're thinking, right? Whether it's negative or positive. And, we can always find the one thing that we did that didn't go well that kind of supports that negative self-talk. I try to find the examples that support the opposite. And where I'm going with this, I know at the beginning we talked a little bit about journaling, and you said you journal some, but not a whole lot. I find that actually journaling about things that I've done that have gone well and what I've learned from that experience helped me out tremendously, because I have almost a kind of like a recorded history, if you will. So when I'm in that headspace where, I'm not good enough for this, I'm not the right I'm not a great father, blah, 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 right? I can open up and go to the actual the validation, the true support, the evidence that says, hey, look, you've done this before, right? You did show up the right way. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. And actually, one of the things I'll do with athletes or executives is what's called a confidence resume. And it's basically active sort of exercise that's basically taking what you've done, but doing it all at once, right? So looking back on your past and identifying highs and what is it that you did to make that thing happen, and what can you extract from that and bring forward into your future that was worth looking at. So I think what you're describing is great. And look, I think I haven't been able to stick with journaling for several reasons, but I actually have stuck a little bit more with it when I've used ChatGPT. And so I've found that to be like quite powerful. And I've used it very similarly to how you're using it, where I'll sort of reflect on like, what is it that I did well today? I often answer kind of three questions, basically. What did I do today that I want to keep doing? What did I do today that I want to do differently? And what did I learn? I try to move away from like what was good and what was bad. It's a little bit less judgmental language and a little bit more kind of like, okay, what's worth repeating and what's worth changing? But I do think, for me, what's worked with journaling, making it sticky, has been simplifying. But there's tons and tons of great data on the value of journaling in all sorts of structures. So absolutely advocate for anyone doing it. If you like to write, if you like to process your thoughts that way, 100%, like by all means, you would have my full support.
Excellent. Very good. So, as we're wrapping up our conversation, there's one other thing I wanted to address with you just very briefly. So, you have written a book, which we're going to put the link in the show notes here, called to Greatness. The things that we've been talking about today, obviously, there's much of that in much greater detail in the book, but share with us very briefly who the book is for and maybe a high level overview of what our audience can expect when they buy that book and begin to consume it and put it into practice.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, Jay, but I'll do my best. So the book is really written for anyone who is interested in going through a sort of structured, evidence-based approach to figuring out how they unlock their full potential. It really was written from a place of like, I was pretty disenchanted with a lot of books in my field, no disrespect to people that had written them. But, a lot of mindset books, frankly, are like one concept repeated 14 times in 14 different settings. It's like this concept at school and this concept at work. And like, that's nice, but there's no one concept that's going to get you to be excellent at something. There's a really interesting line of research called the psychological characteristics of developing excellence. And they've identified something like 24 competencies that are required to even get close to becoming excellent at something, And so
Wow.
I got sort of frustrated with this idea that it would just be one thing. And so I went on a quest to figure out like what would be the things then, right? And we've talked about a lot of them today. We've talked about movement and sleep and nutrition, but a lot of it is quite simple. It's not easy, but it's quite simple to figure out what to do. And then the real hard part is like doing it in a disciplined way consistently, right? Not perfectly, but consistently. And so if you buy the book, what you'll find is the book's broken down into two larger parts. The first is about what I call typical performance, which is basically how you show up well on a day-to-day basis. So what does it mean to do a good job consistently? And then the second part of the book is about those really tough, high-pressure peak performance moments. And how do you get yourself to perform at your peak or be your best when it matters most? Inside, you'll find some practical exercises. You'll find things that you can actually do today that'll help you move in that direction. And so what I think you'll find is you'll get a little bit better at whatever it is that you care about.
You know what? You did a fantastic job in such a short amount of time. I love that. So again, we will put the link in the show notes. And most importantly for all of you right now that are watching and listening, first of all, you'll see me, this from listening to the podcast and watching us. I take a lot of notes. I do that because there's certain things that I want to go back that I want to highlight and remember. But I also want to make sure that I'm prioritizing and actually applying the things that I learn, which is why I always say, and you're going to hear me say it again at the end of this episode, go out and buy the book. Yes, absolutely, right? But please do yourself a favor. The only way that things are going to change is if you read, absorb, and then apply those lessons in your own life. If there's no change, there's no change. So, Alex, I've got one ask and one final question to you. Here is my final question, and then I'll give you my ask. So, what is one of the most difficult decisions that you've had to make in the pursuit of the person you've become? One of the most difficult decisions.
Yeah, the one that comes to mind is the decision to leave the Raptors. It's very rare in professional sports where you're not fired and you leave. And so, it was a very hard decision. I worked with some incredibly talented people. I was very fortunate to work with people who really cared about the work that I did and valued the work that I did. I think it's a really special organization, and it's had some pretty special people come through there. But ultimately, it was about figuring out how to balance my professional identity and my evolving identity as a father. And so, I spent a lot of time reflecting and sort of dialing into my values and who I wanted to become. And it was hard to figure out how I would get to where I wanted to be as a dad while also being on the road, 180 plus days a year. And so ultimately, made that decision from a place of being super grounded in what I care most about and with a lot of confidence that I would figure out whatever the next phase was. And by and large, that's been true. It hasn't been without its challenges, but it was a very difficult decision. And I'd give anyone who's going through something similar the same framework, like, identify what it is you really care about and take the time to reflect honestly with yourself about what that means, and if you're willing to pay the price to do that thing. And if you are, then, take your shot.
Very good. Thank you for sharing that. And then here's my ask. I would love it if you would give all of us, everyone that's watching and listening to us right now, and including me, a challenge. What is just one thing that you would challenge us to do starting as soon as possible?
I would challenge anybody listening to start doing 20 minutes of mindfulness 3 to 5 times a week. We've got tons of data that shows that after about 100 minutes, the actual wiring in your brain starts to change as a function of mindfulness practice. There's tons of data on 8 weeks of 12 minutes a day can lead to big changes. So 20 minutes in general is kind of like the most that you really need to do to extract a lot of the benefits. You can also always do more, of course, but there's sort of like diminishing marginal return. There's still returns, but there's diminishing marginal returns beyond that point. But that basically means after 5 sessions, you'll have some actual changes in your brain as a function of this practice. And what I think is really cool about that is, most people I know would 100% spend 20 minutes in the gym 5 times if they knew it was going to make them stronger or make their, biceps bigger or whatever it is, right? So like this is the same investment for something that will actually happen, right? You're probably not going to get bigger biceps after 5 sessions of curling, but you will get a different brain after 5 20-minute sessions of meditating.
Oh, that is so good. And I hope that the 2 words that all of you are chanting right now is challenge accepted. I know I'm going to take you up on that one. That's fantastic. So Alex, I want to thank you so very much for joining us today on Business Minds Coffee Chat. I knew this was going to be an incredible conversation. You have just shared so many insights, and it's really been such a phenomenal discussion. I want to thank you so much. And I just want you to know how grateful I am for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. I'm grateful for the opportunity. This was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And for all of you, I want to thank you so very much for watching and listening. I do have a quick favor to ask. Would you please take just a moment to subscribe, rate, and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts? That helps us expand our reach and attract amazing guests just like Alex. And to listen to more podcasts, all you need to do is visit jscherbusinessconsulting.com, click that podcast button. And my friends, until next time, keep learning, keep growing. Make sure you run out and pick up a copy of Called to Greatness. And again, apply the lessons you learn. And we'll see you on the next Business Minds Coffee Chat. Take care, everybody.